I find your tone highly inappropriate for a master mapmaker's wife.
And I find your existence highly inappropriate for a master of nothing, Jason Castor. Move, before I use the bucket on your head.
Where am I? Who am I and who are you?
You are engaged.
I beg your pardon?
You were betrothed to my daughter Rose before you went missing in the storm. You must marry her, son. The law demands it.
Promise me, Magnus, that no matter how life becomes, you will always listen for my note.
It is time to bring the prince home and ensure his legacy comes to a permanent end.
Right now, you are looking at a memory written in glass and silver. A sacred bond of childhood shattered the very moment the cold shriek of phantom iron disrupted the earth's natural flow. A prince forced into the dirt of common soil, and some passions powerful enough to unify the earth itself. So take your shoes off, or keep them on if you prefer. What matters is you're here now. Freely step into the house of Cebu, for you are now listening to the records of the map of forgotten stars. In the grand ivy-draped halls of the Whitmore Estates, situated in St. Jude's Hollow, the air usually vibrated with a sweet melodic hum, the sign of a family whose blood was silver-veined, capable of feeling every pulse of the soil and the secret songs of the wind. But that evening, the melody was silenced by the arrival of Dorian Lockwood and his battalion of Iron Clan usurpers carrying phantom iron, weapons forged from a cursed porous metal that didn't just draw blood, it drank the very spirits of those it touched. Inside the great estate, the sound of bone-chilling screech of phantom iron sliced through the harmony of the earth. Servants and house guests alike ran through candlelit corridors with terror painted across their faces. Lord Edmund, Lillian's father, and the high guardian of the silver veins staggered backwards into the grand hall, blood staining the front of his waistcoat. His hands trembled as he pressed against the wound on his side. "No," he whispered. Dorian stepped into the lights, and with a cold clinical efficiency, he raised his phantom iron blade, and as it struck him, the air itself recoiled, turning grey and stagnant as the life force of the Whitmore patriarch was siphoned into the dark metal. Outside the manor, hidden behind the stone fountain, two children crouched beneath the snow-covered hedges. Young Magnus Ashford was breathing so hard his chest hurt. Beside him sat Lillian. Neither child could have been older than 12. The sound coming from the house made no sense to them. Magnus grabbed her hands. It was freezing even through the gloves. Her blue eyes were wet with tears. Magnus immediately moved closer. "It will be all right." His light tasted bitter. The two children had spent nearly every summer together. Their families shared an ancient gift. They were silver-veined, rare bloodlines who sensed resonance of the world, the invisible harmony flowing beneath rivers, mountains, and living hearts. Lillian heard melodies, Magnus saw patterns. Together, they would spend hours imagining where those hidden currents led. One afternoon, as they sat next to each other, their fingers intertwined while they watched the Moonmere Lake, she pointed towards the horizon. "When we are older, we will travel there." Magnus smiled. "And do what?" "Everything," Lillian smiled back. "That's not an answer, Lillian." "It is if you're brave enough." He remembered laughing. He remembered how the sunlight caught in her hair. "Promise me, Magnus, that no matter how life becomes, you will always listen for my note." Magnus gripped her hand, his own pulse sinking with hers in a rhythm of pure, uncorrupted devotion. But as the coup erupted, that promise was torn apart by the smell of burning cedar and ash. Suddenly, a young boy emerged from the shadows. Caspian, Lilian's older brother. His face was streaked with dirt. "We have to go." "Where's father?" Lilian asked with tears-filled eyes. Caspian looked towards the burning estate, his jaw tightened. "Father is gone." The word struck like lightning. Lilian froze. "No." Without waiting for her to process the news, Caspian grabbed his sister's hand. "We have to run." Lilian looked at Magnus as she was being dragged into the fog. "Magnus!" Lilian screamed. The last thing Magnus saw through the haze was the blue of her lace dress vanishing into the mist. Far deep in the castle, Dorian continued wreaking havoc, murdering his own brother-in-law, King Ashford, Magnus's uncle. That night, the Phantom Iron not only claimed the throne, but placed its puppet, Magnus's weak, trembling father, Roderick. Driven by the fear of Dorian, he simply obliged, but everyone knew who truly ruled. The kingdom became a cage and the years marched forward. 16 long years. The cheerful boy who once listened to the wind had become a man who heard only the echoes of his own isolation. He rarely smiled or laughed, rarely allowed anyone close enough to see what he truly felt. Magnus Ashford was now the cold prince of St. Jude's Hollow, a man whose godly physique was a fortress of muscle and stone, yet whose soul was perpetually shivering. He suffered from strange, painful chills, a strange kind of cold that originated from deep within his marrow, a physical manifestation of the dozen of assassination attempts he has survived since Dorian, his uncle, took control. He was also trapped in a loveless marriage of convenience with Ivy, Dorian's daughter, a woman who moved through the castle like a beautiful silent wraith. On one particular bitter evening, as Magnus stood alone upon a palace balcony overlooking the city, a chill ripped through him. His hands gripped the balcony. The pain felt like knives made of ice. Not again. He closed his eyes. The city stretched before him, but something was wrong. The kingdom, St. Jude Hollow, was slowly fading. It had fallen beneath a mysterious affliction called the Pale Slumber. People still walked and spoke, but laughter began vanishing. Births became rare, and hope became rarer. The resonance beneath the kingdom had weakened, and no scholar could explain why. Desperate to wake the earth, the royal council issued a decree that felt like a final gasping breath. Every unmarried citizen, regardless of rank, must find a union within a year to restore the kingdom's vibration. The kingdom needed its people to reconnect, to create life and hope. Magnus cared little for the decree until the day he found a heart-shattering discovery hidden in the shadows of the palace's gardens. He discovered his wife, Ivy, in the arms of a god, Percival. Her belly was already rounding with a child, but painfully finding out that the child was not of the royal bloodline. Before he could bring this treason to light, Dorian moved with the speed of a viper. During a consecration of the steam heart, a massive iron-clogged industrial ritual meant to strengthen Dorian's dominance over nature, an ambush was launched and Magnus was the primary target. He fled into the dense ancient pine woods, the smell of damp soil filling his lungs. Tree roots and branches caught at his face as he struggled to make his way through them on his horse. Suddenly, a sharp whistling sound moved through the air, and in a hot flash, a bolt of phantom iron buried itself in Magnus's shoulder. In the rush of the adrenaline, he hadn't felt the pain, but the sheer force caught him fumbling forward as he fell off his rearing horse, his head hitting the branches before tumbling over the edge of a cliff, deep into the darkness below. No one knew how long he lay there unconscious, but when the world finally stopped spinning, the Prince of St. Jude's Hollow was gone, replaced by a man who didn't even know the weight of his own name. The deafening impact had caused him to lose all his memories. He woke up to the sound of a crackling fire and the smell of stewed herbs. An old man named Barnaby sat in the hearth, his face a map of worry. "You're one lucky man," he muttered. "Most people won't survive that kind of fall." Magnus tried to sit up, but an unimaginable pain struck immediately, sharp as broken glass behind his eyes.
Where am I? Who am I and who are you?
His rescuer Barnaby was a simple villager from Willowbrook, and he was desperate. His daughter Rose was facing the threat of the workhouse, or worse, because of the Prince's Council's own marriage decree. Seeing the broad-shouldered handsome stranger with no memory, Barnaby saw a desperate salvation. "You are awake, Jason," Barnaby said, his voice trembling with the weight of the lie. "You need to lie down and rest." Magnus looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jason? Is that my name?" Barnaby nodded quickly, avoiding the stranger's piercing gaze. "You must have hit your head really bad, Jason Castor. You are the master map maker of this region." Magnus frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't have to. You just have to recover." Magnus's hair throbbing with a dull redeeming ache could only nod in a gaze, accepting a life that felt like a suit of clothes that was 3 sizes too small. Before we follow Magnus deeper into the shadows, ensure you've taken your place within our house. A simple like or a whisper in the comments keep these records alive, and they allow the algorithm to spread our songs. So please, hit that subscribe button to join our house. Now, back to the silence of the Willowbrook. Days later, when Magnus could finally walk, the old man, Barnaby, led him to the outskirts of Willowbrook, somewhere swallowed by green hills and mist, a place that felt untouched by the kingdom's decay. Barnaby stopped near a wooden cottage. "Now listen carefully," he said. You are engaged. I beg your pardon?
You were betrothed to my daughter Rose before you went missing in the storm. You must marry her, son. The law demands it.
Magnus stared at him. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that I am a stranger in a village I do not recognize, and I am somehow betrothed?" Barnaby nodded. "Yes." "And do you expect me to simply accept this?" Magnus continued. Barnaby leaned closer, his voice lowering. "If you refuse, Rose goes to the workhouse under the prince's decree, and she will not survive it." The mention of the prince's name struck something deep inside Magnus, though he did not know why. He pressed his finger to his temple and then looked forward at the cottage. When they were finally brought together for their shotgun marriage in the Willow Square, Rose saw only a tall, arrogant stranger, and Magnus saw a woman whose beauty felt like a phantom limb. Painfully familiar, yet unreachable. Their union was a disaster from the very first hour. Magnus, despite his amnesia, could not shake his royal habits. He refused farm work entirely, declared woodcutting physically demeaning. The villagers began calling him the Bauble, beautiful but useless. "I require my tea to be served in bone china, not this earthen pottery," Jason snapped one morning, looking at the chipped mug with genuine horror. Rose, her sleeve rolled up as she scrubbed the floor, let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "And I require a husband who knows how to chop wood without nearly losing a toe, Jason. But it seems we are both destined to be disappointed. Now take these buckets to the well, or you shall have no tea at all, bone china or otherwise." Magnus stared at the buckets as if they were alien artifacts, his jaw tightening. "I find your tone highly inappropriate for a master map maker's wife." Lillian stood up, wiping a stray of hair from her forehead, her blue eyes flashing with a spark of the fire she used to possess. "And I find your resistance highly inappropriate for a master of nothing, Jason Castor. Move before I use the bucket on your head." But beneath the bickering, a deeper frequency began to hum. One afternoon, while the village was being bullied by a corrupt tax collector who demanded protection silver, Jason stepped forward. He didn't use a weapon, he simply moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. He performed the defensive maneuver, a series of rapid, precise strikes to the collector's pressure points that left the man gasping on the ground, knocking his weapon without a single spill of blood. The villagers watched in stunned silence, and for a moment, Lillian felt a jolt of silver-veined resonance through the sole of her feet. Later, she found him by the edge of the woods, staring at the terrain with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. "You can see it, can't you?" she asked softly, stepping into his personal space. the way the water flows beneath the rock. You didn't learn that from a map, Jason. He turned to her, his arrogance in his eyes replaced by a haunting vulnerability. I don't know where I learned it. I don't know why my hands remember things my mind has forgotten. But when you are near, Rose, the chills in my chest finally stop. Their love began to slowly grow in the psychology of shared silence, during long walks where they did not need words to understand the ache in each other's soul. On a night when the moon was a perfect silver coin, they met at the banks of Waverley. There, the distance between them evaporated into a fever of skin and spirit, and they physically dissolved into one another's rhythm, a soul-bonding passion that finally anchored their hearts to the earth, sharing a solemn goodbye to the people they thought they were, and a silent welcome to the bond they could no longer deny. The piece of Willowbrook was a fragile glass ornament. Alistair Vance, a palace investigator who was face-blind but could see the auras of intent, arrived in the village. He watched the man called Jason walk through the market nearby and nearly collapsed. The aura was unmistakable, a towering golden column of resonance that could only belong to the missing prince. Rumors began to ripple through the valley like a fever, simultaneously finding its way back to the cold spires of St. Jude's Hollow. Dorian Lockwood sat in his study, his fingers tracing the hills of a Lockwood compass, a resonance tracker, a heirloom passed through generations of the Lockwood family that only walked with the blood of Lockwood. He pricked his finger on the sharp needle of the hilt, letting a drop of his blood fall into the mechanism. The compass didn't point north, it began to spin with a metallic hiss, finally locking into a coordinate deep within the woods of the Willowbrook. Dorian's eyes sharpened with a lethal intent. The lost prince has finally been found, he whispered to the shadows with a dark smile on his lips. It is time to bring the prince home and ensure his legacy comes to a permanent end. Dorian marched his forces of Phantom Iron Guards into the streets of Willowbrook, turning every cottage until Magnus was found. The silence that follows Dorian's departure from the village after Magnus's capture was not a peaceful one. It was a hollow, echoing void that seemed to swallow the very air of Willowbrook. On the stone bridge where the moss clung to the damp rock, Magnus stood, facing the woman he knew only as Rose. The Phantom Iron Guards surrounding him, their black armor absorbing the morning light like an ink on parchment. Immediately, Magnus' head throbbed. A little of his memories flickered like a candle caught in a gale. But as he looked at Rose, a singular agonizing truth remained. Leaving her felt like tearing down his own shadow from its heels. He reached out, his finger brushing her cheeks one last time, a painful, solemn goodbye that needed no words to translate its grief. I do not know the man they say I am, he whispered, his voice crackling with vulnerability. But I know every map I've ever walked leads back to the moment on this bridge. Rose could only watch through a veil of tears in her eyes as the carriage pulled away, the wheels grinding against the gravel, leaving her alone with a secret identity that felt heavier than ever. Magnus returned to St. Jude's Hollow, not as a savior, but as a ghost haunting his own throne. The palace was a court of vultures, filled with high-born men and women who wore silk to hide their talons. Though his memory of the village was suppressed by the lingering trauma of the fall and the phantom iron bolts, his body refused to forget. He moved through the echoing marble corridors with a restless energy, his godly physique a stark contrast to the lethargic, glassy-eyed nobles caught in a pale slumber. One afternoon, while the servant was stoking the fire with fresh willow bark, the scent hit Magnus with the force of a physical blow. The bitter, earthy aroma triggered a sensory landslide. Suddenly, he wasn't in the palace. He was a boy under a great willow, holding a girl's hand. He pressed a hand to his chest as the sliver of the memory flickered through his mind. Immediately, he headed for the private study, lunging for a hidden compartment in his desk, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a tattered, leather-bound journal he had written in his younger days. Tucked between the pages was a simple white silk ribbon, still smelling faintly of the wild flowers that grew near Willowbrook. As he caressed the silk, A dam in his mind burst. The coup, the screech of phantom iron, the sight of Lillian vanishing into the fog, the promise made to each other under the willow tree, it all rushed back in like a torrent. He remembered everything. "Rose," he whispered, falling on his knee as the journal slipped from his hands. He realized that the Rose he had married in the village square was the Lillian he had lost in the bloodbath. The cold prince shattered, replaced by a man whose heart was beating with a terrifying, vengeful rhythm. "I remember," he hissed to the empty room. "I remember everything." Dorian Lockwood, sensing the shift in the prince's resonance, knew the time for subtlety had passed. He orchestrated the North Peace Treaty, a strategic lie designed to lure Magnus to a remote Calvinius iron foundry. Magnus walked into the trap, the air thick with the smell of molten metal and the rhythmic deafening clang of industrial hammers. Dorian stood on a high catwalk, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph as his guard leveled their phantom iron blades at the prince. "You were always a beautiful bauble, Magnus," Dorian roared over the noise of the machinery. "But iron is stronger than blood. Your resonance ends here." Magnus did not flinch because he was not alone. Hidden among the ridges, his loyalists waited. Magnus had perceived Dorian was leading him into an ambush, so he came prepared, and they were all armed with a new weapon. He reached for a silver-etched scabbard on his hip, drawing a blade that seemed to catch every stray of spark in the foundry as it reflected a soft tint of blue. It was no ordinary steel. Embedded deep within its spine was a core of Dane glass, an iridescent material that he had discovered during his frantic research into the ancient texts. It was a substance forged in the pressure of the Earth's core, stronger than diamonds and immune to the chi-absorbing properties of the phantom iron, specifically forged to be the only thing capable of shattering the very atoms of the phantom iron, and they were all armed with it. With a roar of defiance, Magnus signaled his loyalists, same time as Dorian. A vivid battle of light against shadow erupted within the foundry. The Dane glass blades hum with a pure crystalline frequency, shattering the phantom iron weapons upon contact. Shards of crossed metal flew through the air like black glass as Magnus cut through the ranks, his movements a blur of silver-veined grace. He cornered Dorian against the massive furnace, the heat of the fire turning their faces a hellish orange. "You stole the world's breath for what?" Magnus said, his voice cold and steady. Dorian swung his phantom iron blade with the desperation of a man nearing defeat. Magnus blocked every strike, moving with evasive precision, and with all his strength, aimed for an opening, swinging his Dane glass blade against Dorian's phantom iron, splitting it in half with a deafening crack. The impact sent Dorian staggering backwards, his mask of arrogance shattered into raw terror as his heels slipped from the iron ledge. He plummeted into a great crucible underneath. A soul-piercing shriek tore from his throat, a wet, agonizing sound of a man being unmade by his own machines. For a fleeting second, his skin became a map of glowing blackened cracks. The phantom iron bored into his skin before he was consumed by the molten orange light. A sudden violent hiss followed, then a heavy absolute silence. The usurper fell into the shadows of his own making, and for the first time in 16 years, the oppressive weight of the Lockwood name was lifted from the kingdom. In the aftermath of a bloodbath, the palace felt unnervingly quiet. Magnus found Dorian's daughter, his first wife, Ivy, in the lunar gardens. Her trunks were packed for a journey she expected would lead to her execution. She knelt down before him, her head bowed. "I am a Lockwood by name, but a prisoner by nature," she whispered, her voice trembling. Magnus looked at her, and then at the guard, Percival, who stood a few paces behind her, his hand resting on his sword, but his eyes fixed on Ivy with a desperate devotion. "My father forced our union," Ivy continued, looking up at Magnus with the tear-stained eyes. "I didn't choose to be a Lockwood. I was a bird born in a cage of iron. And Percival did not love my status. He loved even the woman who cried in the dark. I would rather be a commoner in his arms than a queen in your cold bed. The union Percival and I share is born out of love, Magnus. If you must take a life for our sins, take mine, but let him live." Magnus felt a pang of profound empathy as he saw his own struggle mirrored in her desperation. He reached down, taking her hand not to restrain her, but to lift her up. "Go," he said softly. "The kingdom has had enough marriages built on contracts." In utter shock mixed with overwhelming joy, she stood up as she said, "Thank you, Magnus," hastily turning to Percival, waving her final goodbyes to the royal life. Lillian's name was officially exonerated, and the Whitmore legacy restored to the annals of history. But she refused to return to the capital. She retreated to the Whispering Dales, a small quiet town inside Willowbrook, where the air was clear and all the trauma of the palace experience as a child couldn't reach her. 7 months passed, the kingdom was healing, but the pale slumber still lingered in corners of the world, a remnant of a heart that hadn't quite woken up. King Roderick, in a final act of paternal wisdom, claimed to have lost the ancient land deeds of the Willowbrook, demanding the prince personally investigate the matter. Magnus arrived in the Dales as the sun was beginning to set, the sky a bruised purple and gold. A day in Willowbrook, and all he could think about was his lost childhood love, and he was not about to lose her even now. Upon scouring the small town, he found her in a small garden, utterly similar to the garden they had once bickered over the quality of earthen pottery. He didn't approach her with the heralds of a prince. He walked to her as a man who had once chopped wood poorly and demanded tea he didn't earn. He held out a parchment. It was a hand-drawn map of the stars, exactly as they had appeared over the Waverley Mere on the night he had first realized they were in love as children. The parchment was tied with Lillian's own silk ribbon. "Lillian," he whispered. She looked at the map, at the ribbon, then at him, her blue eyes filling with a light that had been missing for months, realizing the bubble she had fallen in love with as a commoner was her childhood love from her forgotten past. Tears gathered at the side of her eyes. Magnus drew closer. Her breath trembled slightly, her lips, totally lost for words, overwhelmed with the surge of different emotions. Feeling the silence, they both leaned in, and as their lips finally met in a collision of souls, the air around them began to vibrate on a rhythmic thrum that started in the garden and rippled outward towards the entire kingdom, and the pale slumber completely evaporated. The months that followed in a great awakening, Lillian finally stood where she was born to be, at the high altar of the marble cathedral, draped in heavy ivory velvet and intricate silver thread lace. Beside her, Magnus stood with an imposing authority of a true king, his fingers interlaced with hers as they exchanged vows of soul and spirit. Well, Magnus and Lillian's journey proved that the vibration of union isn't created by a royal decree, but by the courage to be vulnerable with another human. Please let me know your thoughts about the story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to catch our next story. Thanks for watching. Bye.